Joining us now is Renee Buhr, a political science professor with the University of St. Thomas. Professor, thanks so much for sharing. This is your wheelhouse. Your area of expertise is foreign affairs. So tell us, in your estimation, why is Russia invading Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Tim. Yes, this definitely is an area that I have a particular interest in. Why is Putin invading Ukraine at the moment? That is the question that people who have been observing Putin for 30 years are still trying to figure out. So there's no doubt that Russia and the Putin administration specifically has really been trying to control Ukraine since 2004. So in 2004, Ukraine starts to pull away in a much more noticeable way from Russian control. Putin takes that personally because he does believe that Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia should be very closely allied. And it's the 2004 election that ultimately was the first demonstration of Ukraine declaring its own independence and self-governance. So in the 2004 election, you have the pro-Ukrainian candidate, Yushchenko, and a pro-Russian candidate, Yanukovych. And Putin clearly supported Yanukovych because he would be more amenable to Russia's interests. And ultimately, Yushchenko had won, but they rigged the election to make it look like Yanukovych had won. This led to what's known as the Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution was an uprising by the Ukrainian people. And it lasted several months and ultimately resulted in a new election where Yushchenko won. So that was the first stage where Ukrainian government really was fairly broken away from the Soviet history. And from there on out, the subsequent elections were of keen interest to Russia because they wanted someone in there who was going to do, to act in their interests. And so Yanukovych runs again in 2010 and actually wins fairly. And so in about 2013, after walking a line, engaging with the EU and engaging with Russia, he rejects the EU, turns towards Russia, and this triggers what's called the Maidan. So that is this movement in late 2013, early 2014. Again, Ukrainian people rise up. They oppose Yanukovych's decision and his increasing authoritarian behavior. And he eventually flees to Russia. And a new government is later elected that is independent again of Russia under Petro Poroshenko. Shortly after that, that's when Russia invades Crimea and annexes it, and then also starts providing military support and troops to separatists in Donbass.
So there's been this tension, this push and pull between nationalism inside Ukraine about whether they want to align with Russia or become more Western-like and join more of the European economic system.
That's absolutely right. And the big challenge for Ukraine is that there are good reasons why they want to be connected to the EU, and there are good reasons why they want to be connected to Russia. So for years, they followed what was called the multivectoral foreign policy, which engaged both with the EU and with Russia. And the extent to which it gets pulled too far in one direction, there's someone in Ukraine who is going to benefit from being pulled farther in one direction, and another person who is going to suffer as a result of being pulled in one direction. So it makes for a very difficult balancing game for the Ukrainian president to stay engaged in both sides. Most of the reasons are economic, honestly. So East Ukraine's economy is very closely tied to Russia. West Ukraine's economy is very closely tied to the EU. And then you have a linguistic aspect to this. So it's important to begin by saying the vast majority of people who live in Ukraine are ethnically Ukrainian. But in the West, they tend to prefer to speak Ukrainian as their first language, though they can speak Russian fluently. And in the East, they prefer to speak Russian as their first language, and they are also fluent in Ukrainian. So it's a preference.
So how much did Putin's annexation of Crimea serve as a wedge between the pro-Russian population in Ukraine and the population that really wanted to become more tied to the EU?
I think it's hard to say what role Crimea may have played in that. So Crimea was a little unusual to begin with. Crimea is, Putin likes to say, it was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev. Obviously, that's cherry picking history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And however we slice it, Crimea is, in terms of international law, part of Ukraine. So whether Russia believes there's a historical claim there or not, in terms of the law, Crimea is Ukrainian. So that being said, a lot of former Soviet military like to retire to Crimea because it's pretty and it's on the water. And so there was a sort of domestic, for lack of a better term, population in Crimea proper that is ethnically Russian, ethnically Belarusian, right? So don't identify as closely with Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Donbass, that's much more of a sort of pretty unambiguously, Ukrainian, but separatist politicians and military, paramilitary essentially were responsible for the division there.
Mm-hmm. There's an excellent analysis that I read last night from a former Wall Street Journal reporter who spent a number of years reporting in Ukraine, who basically said, look, this is all about energy and oil. That's what this is really all about, because so much of Russia's economy and Putin's economic stream to keep the country sustainable is coming from Ukraine. What's your take on that, Professor?
It's absolutely true that oil and gas are essential to Putin and oil and gas revenues. So Putin became president after an almost 10 years long horrific economic depression. And his main source of legitimacy has been stabilizing the economy and providing the Russian people with a comfortable life, not one where they have a lot of rights or democratic powers, but a comfortable, stable. And a big part of that was the stabilization fund that Putin developed. That is where they draw in oil and gas revenues, and they save it for a rainy day. So when there is an economic crisis or a shock of some kind, then he can divert that money into the Russian economy in ways that maintain stable prices and stable cost of living and such. That was his main source of legitimacy throughout most of his presidency. And ironically, the annexation of Crimea and the sanctions that followed did serious damage to that legitimacy. And so for people who've been watching this, like me, for a while, we can't understand why you'd want to incur more sanctions. So that is where, for me, the disconnect exists.
But is in Putin's mind, is securing these energy routes and energy sources in Ukraine, does that sustain at least a level of income to keep Russia paying its bills and him in power?
It very well could, but I think then he's not taking into account the impact of sanctions on that, right? So you can refuse to purchase Russian oil because of the things that that Putin has, the acts he's committed recently. So on the one hand, make sure you have control of the infrastructure. That is definitely in Putin's interest. He also always is creeping a little closer in Georgia to independent pipelines as well. So we have no question that Putin is very concerned about gaining control of as many pipelines as possible. Mm-hmm. But starting a war with Ukraine is going to not only be exceedingly costly, but also the follow-on effects like sanctions are going to make it harder for him to reap the benefits of that oil wealth. So
let's talk about the sanctions and use of power in this particular conflict, because President Biden has vowed not to send any U.S. troops to defend Ukraine. And without any military intervention from either the United States or NATO, is Putin basically free to do whatever he wants in Ukraine, whether there are sanctions or not?
I would say he isn't free to do whatever he wants. The biggest challenge he's going to face, first and foremost, are Ukrainians. So if there's one thing the Ukrainians have learned since 2004, it's that they have to fight for their independence, right? And that Russia is very often the main actor behind any attempt to rob them of that independence. So at the very least, we're going to see Ukrainians who are willing to dig in. And that is not going to be an easy conflict, right? So just that part of the picture. You also have the Baltic states, which are not only trying to support Ukraine and NATO members, but also have a stake in this, because the Putin administration's people at the UN lately have been accusing the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, accusing them of mistreating their Russian minorities. And so they're laying a rationale and a groundwork to defend the Russian people in the Baltics as well. So the Baltics have a good reason to fight this tooth and nail. So are they equivalent to the might that the Russian military has? Absolutely not. And even to some extent, it's questionable whether NATO does, unless we're willing to be very proactive. But it's the thing that puzzles analysts is that it seems like this is an awfully costly way of trying to achieve anything.
I'm often reminded in the past week or so about the old Mao Zedong quote that my old political science professor used to drill on us, and that power comes from the barrel of a gun, according to Mao Zedong. And it seems like this is what Russia is wanting to exercise right now.
I would agree, unfortunately. It does seem to me that the attempts to control Ukraine indirectly through messing with Ukrainian elections, through working through these proxies in Donbass, it would appear that Putin is just not satisfied with those indirect methods anymore. One of the theories going around is maybe he wants to install a friendly government in Kyiv, and that would be in keeping with his past behavior. It's just a massive escalation thereof. So there's a little speculation that could he have just lost his mind, because we have been able to predict his behavior very consistently for 30 years based on a sort of cost-benefit analysis. And he always went for the cheap wins, and this is not a cheap win.
I think one of the ultimate questions here, in your mind, how could America get drawn into this?
That is very difficult to speculate on. So I'll start by just saying my analyst training makes me very reluctant to predict the future. But that being said, Ukraine is a fellow democracy, right? It is a transitional democracy. It's fighting tooth and nail to do what we call consolidate, right? Become a fully fledged democracy. This does mean that there's a community of democratic states, the United States included, that has some interest in trying to, help Ukraine stay independent. Would we get engaged? At this point, my short answer is I don't think we're going to. We pulled Americans out of harm's way, which is fairly standard practice. So I don't want to make it sound like that's unusual. But in security studies, there's a strategy that we refer to as a tripwire. So you keep some of your soldiers, usually people who have signed up for potential conflict, you keep them in harm's way so that if an enemy attacks, then you are committed to avenging the deaths of your troops, right, of those Americans. By pulling the Americans and the Brits specifically out, we removed the tripwire, which does seem to make it less costly to Putin to invade, right? He still has to worry about Ukrainian resistance and other NATO members, but by not having that American tripwire in there or the British tripwire, we did change his calculus a little, I think. That being said, he seems so determined. He may have just killed a whole bunch of Brits and Americans and not given it a second thought, because this doesn't seem like a person who is thinking clearly about the costs of what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. How can this affect, and will it affect, everyday Americans?
In the short term, we're very far away from this. Globalization is the main reason why we'll feel any impact, right? So obviously the stock markets are already taking a hit. That's not surprising given how globalized trade is, how globalized the economy is, how much our own production depends on, oil and gas. Thankfully, we have enough for our own consumption. We're not dependent on Russia the way that Germany is. So that helps, right? We have a layer of insulation from that blackmail that can come with Russia controlling your access to oil and gas. The longer term issue, there'll be economic impacts. I think that if this turns into a full occupation of Ukraine, I do think we'll have to think very seriously about Ukrainian refugees. And if this spreads into the Baltics, refugees from the Baltics as well, because that will be a major follow-on effect. That won't happen immediately, but it's likely to be something we have to think very seriously about as well.
Do you foresee the President Biden sending more troops into the Baltics that are NATO members to help shore up their borders?
It certainly sounds like we are sending in more materiel. I haven't seen anything yet, though this changes by the minute now. I haven't seen anything yet about troops per se since the conflict began last night, but definitely more materiel that is going to friendly forces in those areas. I believe training is our most likely route, right? So we have these things we call train and equip programs, where we'll work with NATO members or even aspiring NATO members, as was the case with Georgia, and just train their troops so that they are better prepared to handle the situation. And in Georgia in 2008, it actually worked very well. So we had done multiple train and equip programs with Georgia prior to that time. And the Georgian military was well trained and they were well equipped. And so Putin moved troops in August of 2008, and the Georgian troops were able to push his troops back within 2 weeks. So that does yield more benefits than it might appear. So I think that is a good strategy. It's been tested in the past and it worked in Georgia, so maybe it can work for our other allies as well.
Professor, is there an end game here for Putin? And does anyone really know, I guess, at this point?
Sadly, no. Again, my analytical training tends to prejudice me towards worst case scenarios because I would rather be wrong in the direction of a worst case scenario than underestimate the threat. So my worry is that this could mean total, what they say, a decapitation of the Ukrainian government, replacement of the Ukrainian government by a friendly Russian regime. It could go as far as the Baltics because of the things that the Russian government has been saying at the UN and the rationales they're using for the need to protect quote unquote Russians, right? Some are ethnically Russian, some are just linguistically so in the Baltics. It's a very similar rationale to what we've seen in Ukraine since 2013. and even before that, but 2013 is where it became much more high stakes. So the end game, probably this doesn't stop at Ukraine. Worst case scenario. Best case scenario, this is really costly for him. And like in Georgia in 2008, he decides it's not worth it. That would be best case scenario.
What are you going to be watching for in the days ahead now? Maybe perhaps even in the hours ahead?
So the things I'm keeping track of are troop movements. What kinds of targets are the Russian and now apparently Belarusian troops targeting? Locations are really important. Part of this is, Putin will say, oh, we're just worried about the Nazis, quote unquote, or we're just worried about, Kyiv. But if you look at the places they're targeting Odessa, which is a primarily Russian-speaking city. They're targeting Kharkiv, primarily Russian-speaking city. So I'm keeping track of where the assaults are happening, what the identity of those places are, right? Just seeing what comes next in terms of what Putin says, what Lukashenko says in Belarus, if he says anything, and then the safety of the Ukrainian government, right? Zelensky and his top officials, right? Where is he? Is he safe? Is he able to govern? Those are the things I'll be kind of watching for.
So many moving parts right now.
Yes.
Professor Renee Buhr of University of St. Thomas, thanks so much for your time here today. Deeply appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.